Imagine you're held down, your screams lost in the roar of a crowd. An enemy's hands, stained with the blood of your family, press a cold blade to your back. The legend says this isn't a quick death. It's a ritual. Your skin is peeled away from your spine, your ribs cracked and pulled outwards to create a grotesque, crimson pair of wings. This was the Blood Eagle, the most terrifying story of Viking justice. But was this nightmare ritual a real historical practice, performed on living men? Or is it just a dark and twisted ghost story, whispered by chroniclers to paint their pagan foes as monsters? The Viking Age, from the late 8th to the 11th century, was an era of violent collision. From Scandinavia, Norsemen exploded onto the world stage as raiders, explorers, and merchants. Their society was governed by a complex code of honor where reputation was everything, and an insult to your family could only be washed away with blood. It's from this brutal, honor-bound world that the legend of the Blood Eagle emerges. The sagas, epic tales written down centuries after the events they describe, speak of this ritual in horrified tones. They paint a picture of ultimate vengeance, a punishment reserved for the most hated enemies, a sacrifice to the All-Father, Odin. For centuries, the image of the Blood Eagle has captivated and horrified us, becoming the ultimate symbol of Viking brutality. But today, our journey isn't just about the gore. We're going to investigate this mystery with historical texts, archaeology, and modern science. Did the Blood Eagle really happen? Who were its supposed victims? And most importantly, why? What could possibly motivate a culture to invent such a cruel story, let alone practice the act itself? To find the answers, we first have to travel back to the 9th century, to a story of two kings, a shameful death, and a promise of vengeance that would set the stage for one of history's most gruesome tales. To understand the Blood Eagle, you have to understand Viking vengeance. It wasn't a simple act of payback. It was a sacred duty passed from father to son, a debt that could only be settled with the enemy's suffering. No story illustrates this better than the legendary feud between the great Viking hero, Ragnar Lothbrok, and the Anglo-Saxon king, Aella of Northumbria. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose name means hairy breeches, is a figure wrapped in myth. He might have been one man, or a mix of several real-life warlords. But in the sagas, he's the classic Viking king. Fearless, ambitious, and father to sons who would become even more famous than him. According to the 13th century tale of Ragnar Lothbrok, an aging Ragnar, not wanting to be outdone by his sons, decided to conquer England with just 2 ships. It was a mission born of pride, and it failed spectacularly. His small force was quickly overwhelmed by the army of King Aella. King Aella, a real historical figure who ruled Northumbria in the mid-9th century, didn't show mercy. He captured Ragnar and, in an act of ultimate humiliation, had him executed by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. As the story goes, Ragnar didn't scream. Instead, he prophesied a terrible revenge, famously declaring, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." The little pigs were his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. When news of their father's dishonorable death reached his sons, their reaction was cold, calculated fury. Ivar the Boneless, whose nickname is still debated by historians, knew that pure anger wasn't enough. Vengeance needed a plan. In 865 AD, that plan began. Ivar and his brothers assembled the Great Heathen Army, a massive Viking force that landed in East Anglia. After 2 years of raiding, they turned their sights north to Northumbria and to King Aella. In 867 AD, they captured the city of York, and King Aella himself was taken alive. Now, with their father's murderer at their mercy, a simple execution wouldn't do. A shameful death in a snake pit had to be answered with a death of unimaginable agony and ritual meaning. According to Norse sources, it was here, on the back of King Aella, that the sons of Ragnar chose to exact their terrible price. It was here they supposedly performed the Blood Eagle. Aella's death wasn't just a killing, it was a message. It was the old boar's prophecy fulfilled, a declaration that the sons of Ragnar had collected their debt. This act, whether historical or legendary, became the primary and most infamous example of the Blood Eagle, forever linking the ritual to the powerful motive of family vengeance. To understand the full horror of the Blood Eagle legend, we have to walk through the ritual as later, more elaborate accounts describe it. It's important to remember that the earliest sources are much simpler, just mentioning carving an eagle on the back. The gruesome step-by-step process was likely embellished over the centuries by storytellers. The first step was restraint. The victim was forced face down, exposing their back and stripping them of their final shred of dignity. The second step began the ordeal. The executioner, using a sharp knife, would make 2 deep cuts down either side of the spine. The skin and muscle would then be flayed open, peeling back from the bone to expose the rib cage. The agony would have been incomprehensible. Some later accounts even mention salt being rubbed into the massive wound to intensify the suffering. The third step is where the ritual truly earns its name. An axe or another heavy weapon would be used to chop each rib away from the spine. One by one, the bones would be severed. Once freed, the ribs were bent outwards and forced up, creating the shape of huge, bloody wings. The fourth and final step was the horrifying climax of the story. The executioner would reach into the ravaged cavity and pull out the victim's lungs, draping them over the splayed-out wings of the ribcage. The sagas describe a final, chilling spectacle. As the dying victim took their last gasps, the lungs would flutter weakly, like the gentle flapping of a bird's wings. This entire process was a performance, meant to strike terror into the hearts of enemies. But was King Aella the only one to supposedly suffer this fate? As we look deeper into the sagas, we find his story isn't entirely unique. While King Aella's story is the most famous, he's not the only alleged victim of the Blood Eagle. The Norse sagas mention a few other names, suggesting that, at least in literary tradition, this was a known, if rare, form of punishment for the elite. One of the clearest accounts comes from the Orkney Inga saga. It tells the story of Halfdan Longleg, a Norwegian prince. In a power struggle, Halfdan murdered an earl named Ragnvald Eystein by burning him alive in a house, a dishonorable death. Vengeance fell to Ragnvald's son, Thorfeinar. After capturing Halfdan, the saga claims Einar carved the eagle on his back with a sword and cut all the ribs from the spine and drew the lungs out there. This account is notable because it explicitly calls the act a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death, as thanks for victory. Another name sometimes connected to the ritual is King Edmund of East Anglia, who later became Street Edmund the Martyr. He was killed in 869 by the same great heathen army that would later capture King Aella. However, the primary historical sources, written by Christians, say he was tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, and then beheaded for refusing to renounce his faith. The Blood Eagle connection is purely speculative and not supported by the evidence. These saga stories, whether about a Northumbrian king or a Norwegian prince, share a common thread. The Blood Eagle wasn't for common criminals. It was a fate supposedly reserved for elites who had committed a terrible offense against another powerful family, often for causing the bad death of a male relative. The problem? All these accounts are just stories, written down hundreds of years after the events. This brings us to the most crucial question: is any of this history, or is it all just fiction? For centuries, the story of the Blood Eagle was mostly taken as fact. But in the 20th century, scholars started to seriously question the legend. The debate today splits historians, those who think it was a real practice, and a much larger camp who believes it was a literary invention. The biggest argument against the Blood Eagle is the complete lack of physical evidence. To date, no skeleton has ever been found with the telltale cut marks of such a procedure. In a culture that left behind a rich archaeological record, including other forms of ritual killing, this silence is deafening. Furthermore, the written sources are deeply problematic. The Norse sagas were written in the 12th and 13th centuries, a full 200 to 300 years after the Viking Age events they claim to describe. They were compiled in a Christian Iceland by authors looking back at their pagan ancestors. This time gap means the stories were passed down orally for generations, where they could have been easily exaggerated or changed. Many historians now believe the Blood Eagle was born from a misunderstanding of complex Norse poetry. In the metaphorical world of skaldic poetry, carving an eagle on an enemy's back could have simply been a poetic phrase for a brutal death in battle, where a victor leaves his foe face down for carrion birds, like eagles, to feast upon. Over time, this powerful image could have been misinterpreted by later Christian writers who weren't familiar with the poetic conventions and turned into the literal, gruesome ritual we know today. However, some argue that the ritual's existence is plausible. They point out that spectacular, ritualized violence was not out of character for the Viking elite. We have archaeological proof of other strange, deviant burials, showing a willingness to mutilate corpses for symbolic reasons. In that context, the blood eagle, while extreme, might fit a known pattern of behavior where warriors used spectacular violence to build their reputation. The debate remains stuck, with vivid stories on one side and a complete lack of proof on the other. But a new line of questioning has recently opened up. Forget whether it did happen for a second. Could it have happened? For a long time, the sheer complexity of the blood eagle was used as an argument against it. It just seemed too difficult to actually perform. But a recent study combining modern medical knowledge with historical analysis came to a startling conclusion. The procedure is, for the most part, anatomically possible. From a medical perspective, flaying the skin from the back is achievable. The hardest part would be severing the ribs without puncturing the lungs. An axe would be too clumsy. Researchers proposed that a small, barbed Viking spearhead could have been used to carefully unzip the ribs from the spine. So, the bloody wings could, in theory, be created. But what about that final dramatic act, the fluttering of the lungs? This is where the grim reality of science collides with poetry. The moment the chest cavity is opened, both lungs would instantly collapse. The victim would die within seconds from massive blood loss and oxygen deprivation. There is absolutely no way a person could remain alive through the whole procedure, let alone be conscious at the end. That final fluttering of the lungs is medically impossible. This scientific analysis is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It tells us that if the blood eagle was ever performed, the victim would have died very early on. The rest of the ritual, arranging the ribs and pulling out the lungs, would have been post-mortem mutilation performed on a corpse. This doesn't prove the ritual happened, but it does suggest that the legends, while dramatically exaggerating the conscious suffering, might be based on a feasible, if still horrific, act. It was a rapid execution followed by the symbolic arrangement of a dead body. This leaves us with the final question: why? Why create such a powerful and disturbing story? To understand why the story of the blood eagle was so powerful, we have to think like a Viking. Their world was shaped by honor, fate, and violent gods. The most obvious motivation is vengeance. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about restoring family honor. In Norse society, a man's reputation was his most valuable asset. A bad death, like being killed without a chance to fight back, was a deep stain on that honor. The story of the blood eagle was the ultimate response, an overwhelming display of brutality to erase that shame and send a clear message to all rivals. The legend also has a deep religious meaning. Several sources connect the blood eagle to Odin, the god of kings, warriors, and death. The eagle was one of his sacred symbols. By describing the carving of an eagle onto a victim and offering him to Odin, the storyteller was creating a powerful religious narrative. It transformed a simple revenge killing into a sacred ceremony, legitimizing the violence in the eyes of the community. Finally, the tale of the blood eagle was a weapon of psychological warfare. Public executions were social theater in the Viking Age. The story of this ritual, with its methodical process and shocking result, would have been an incredibly effective performance of power. For anyone who heard it, the message was clear: do not cross this family. It was a story that helped the Viking elite police their own ranks and build fearsome reputations. So, the legend of the blood eagle was more than just a tale of torture. It was a story that combined personal honor, religious duty, and political strategy all at once. The blood eagle remains one of history's most chilling questions, existing in the shadows between fact and fiction. We've walked through the saga legends of Ragnar Lothbrok and the terrible revenge his sons supposedly took on King Aella. We've seen how a few other unlucky nobles allegedly met the same fate in these stories. But we've also confronted the hard truth. There is zero archaeological proof the ritual ever took place. Most historians today believe it was a literary invention, born from a misreading of complex poetry and exaggerated by Christian writers centuries later. And yet, modern science tells us the act itself was anatomically possible, though it would have been a swift execution followed by post-mortem mutilation, not a prolonged torture. The victim would have been dead long before the story's climax. So, Was the blood eagle real or a myth? The overwhelming lack of evidence suggests it is a legend. Without new proof, it will likely remain a ghost story locked in the pages of the sagas. But whether fact or fiction, its legacy is undeniable. It remains a potent symbol of the Viking Age, an era of violence, honor, and epic stories. The legend forces us to look into the darkest corners of the past and ask what we are capable of when driven by vengeance, faith, and a thirst for power. The blood eagle may never have actually taken flight, but the terror of its image has soared through the centuries, a dark legend that continues to haunt our imagination. What's your take? Do you think the blood eagle was a real, horrifying practice, or is it one of history's most successful ghost stories? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring the strange and fascinating corners of the past, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching.